Hello, and thank you for coming. I'd like to start off by thanking everyone here who's helped me out. Cuesta, everyone, David, B, Sabrina, Lauren, everybody at the gallery. I'm just so happy with the way the show looks, and everybody's just been a wonderful, wonderful help. So I wanted to kind of give a talk that described where my work is now, where the work came from, and my influences, talking a little bit also about me being a student and throwing back some of the earlier work that I did and how it's influencing my work today. So to begin with, I wanted to show a picture of Iceland at midnight. Most of this work started from a residency in Skagaströnd, Iceland, summer of 2008, so feels like just yesterday, but quite a long time ago. And Nez Artist Residency takes place in this small little fishing village, and that tiny house in that bottom right corner was where I stayed. And the structure in which we made work was just sort of around the bay. And I had the fortunate opportunity of being roommates with an Icelandic writer named Bjarni Bjarnason. And that roughly translates to bear, son of bear. And he had a car, more importantly, so we would take these long road trips around Highway 1, which is the only road in Iceland. It loops all the way around, and he would tell me stories. Everything in Iceland has to do with a story. So when you ask somebody, what's the name of this mountain, they go, oh, and then they'll tell you the name of the mountain and then why it's named this, the whole story behind it. And in one of these little adventures, he told me about these tiny abandoned houses that are buried everywhere. And apparently, up until about the 1950s, in order for a man to get married, he had to own a house, a sheep, and be self-employed, something sort of kind of random like that. I haven't checked those facts, but I don't really want to know if it's true. I believe it, and so thus I'm going with it. And these tiny houses, this kind of story, this folklore of these men trudging out into the middle of this uninhabitable landscape, plopping down a house, getting married, and then immediately running back to Reykjavik was wonderful. And they left these kind of abandoned houses that were the only markers of how this distance, this great landscape, this great scheme. And so I spent so much time trying to reconcile these landscapes, and to do so, I was like, you cannot contain this power, this harsh beauty, and so I omitted it. And my only markers for the scale of this landscape and this whole view would be these tiny homes. So I made these small 9 by 11 inch, 12 by 16 inch graphite drawings where the only markers, the indication of the landscape were the houses, were the homes. Here is, again, Skagaströnd, and you can picture me sitting on top of a hill, maybe a jaunty little beret on the top of my head, a pencil right behind my ear, diligently drawing. That actually wasn't happening. I was freezing most of the time. But here's a detail of the work, kind of shows you the scale. And these became kind of a big break for me. In undergrad and in grad school, I was always really interested in Chinese scroll paintings, Japanese ink landscapes, and cartography. This idea that it is an image, it is an art form, but it is also a narrative, a history of a time, of a place, of a scope, of a scale. And that's kind of my relationship to this land and to these houses. Here we have a glacier kind of coming through the center of this harsh landscape, and thinking about these ink scroll paintings, there was just such kind of a connection for me of a way to think about this land and this landscape. Here kind of gives you a good idea of that scale. That tiny little red dot and that tiny little yellow dot are people. So I'm on top of this big kind of black soiled hill with this epic glacier. And if you ever have a chance to go see a glacier, do. They're just amazing. And you're so far away and the air is so clear that things seem very close while also being very far. So I traveled around with Bjarni and took pictures and made drawings, thinking about the paper, the weight of the paper. There's something that just always feels kind of unfinished and raw about gessoed canvas. But paper has a weight all in of its own. Paper can kind of hold a presence, an emptiness that gesso and other surfaces can't. And so I created these just millions and millions of drawings, as many as possible, looking at this iron, rugged lava fields and making the connections. I'm about to go home. I'm living in Texas at the time. I'm thinking this space, and maybe not the same harsh beauty, but it has that same epic vastness as West Texas does. So I got back to Austin. I jumped in a car and drove out to West Texas, trying to search for these same sort of pioneer style houses and spaces and landscape in America, kind of making this connection. What would this look like to make, or what would these feel like? What would these homes look like in West Texas? And so, of course, a lot of that in Texas is trailers. And I had lots of these, again, omitting the landscape, drawing the man-made, trying to kind of bring attention to what is not there, having this sense that you, the viewer, fills in a lot of that. So it's closer to these ideas of reading, of you're reading and you're imagining and you're bringing what your history is and your knowledge of that space to that landscape that was more vivid and more real than as if the landscape was actually drawn in. So this is Fort Davis, which is a little town outside Marfa, Texas. Kind of these big, grand, epic homes and tiny trailers sharing in this same space. Lots of sides of the highway, lots of road trip images. So here is a good image of what West Texas and what that kind of landscape looks like. And then here would be the drawing. So it's really important to me that these be real spaces, that these are spaces that exist and that people live here, people inhabit this. This is part of the history of the landscape and the history of the area. I wanted to have that repetition, that rhythm as you're going through and you're seeing things in a car or through a car window. You're not necessarily getting out and stopping and taking pictures of all this. Some of this is just quickly speeding by and getting that moment, that memory, that history, which again kind of goes back to cartography for me, this idea that this is just a memory, the history, the building up. You know, old artists would sit up their canvases on the side of a boat, and the boat would kind of travel down the river or an ocean, and they would quickly paint or sketch in the edges of what that topography looked like, and that would be a way to kind of map the landscape to then hand to other people to find out where they are. So this sort of connection to the people and the land and the history of the place was always in my mind, and very important. So coming back from West Texas, I'm in Austin, school starting up again, and I'm commuting 2 days a week down to San Antonio. So I'm spending kind of half of my time in the car and half of my time in the car at night. This is on I-35 on the way down to Austin. The lights illuminating that landscape, and so you're kind of getting a hint of what is there without it there, and I sort of let that hint be there because it was illuminated through sort of a man-made light. This was most of my commute, that sort of foggy, eerie zone. And my grad school history, the stuff that I was really interested in grad was painting and painting landscapes. So as I'm making these drawings, I'm thinking about how can I kind of bring that same energy, these same ideas into a painting, this sort of stacking of horizon lines, this history of a commute in one image. And so this is a San Antonio commute. And we have this evolution from Austin down south through I-35 and then coming into San Antonio. You can see Six Flags over Texas, or Fiesta, Texas, I think, in San Antonio, kind of in the distance. Iceland is ever present in my mind, and I'm thinking about, again, this connection between the American landscape, what was going in Iceland, this raw, rugged vastness. So here is the Pacific Northwest. And then this is Iceland. So I'm looking for these connections, trying to think how I can bring this into my paintings, this fracturing, this build-up, this history, and making small gouaches. And these felt just kind of like unusual pieces for me at the time. But I wanted to include them because I can see the layering of this watercolor, these marks. Although it was just one incident in a long line of work, I see the echoes of that in the way I layer graphite now and the work I'm making right now. So I'm making these houses that omit the landscape, and I'm feeling a need for a change. This is one of the last pieces that I made in which I omitted nature. And so I went from here, and I flipped it. So then I started to remove the man-made structures and just draw in the natural form. And I'm drawing in these ideas of trees, these different elements of nature, using a lot of addition of graphite, a lot of removal with erasers, but it's more about like what are these symbols, what does this build up to kind of have a feeling of naturalistic without it actually being natural. This more pixelization, this more mark, what are these symbols that build up that have us read natural form? And that idea, this sort of faux landscape, I brought back into the painting. So I have two kind of parallel themes going on. The drawings on one hand, and then the paintings on the other. And so this painting, which is 9 feet by 6 feet, is of the Pacific Northwest. And it has that same sort of geometric feel, that stacking that's happening in the graphite drawings, but it's created in a much different way, and it's allowing me to use color. So this image here, if we look at the greenery, that foliage, it's really made of hundreds of thousands of little triangles painted in oil over and over and over and over again. This pixelization that gets built up into this faux realism. I love the sort of grandness, this big boldness of the redwoods and those big trees. And I'm thinking about people like Wayne Thiebaud, who has this connection. People think of him often as a pop artist or in kind of that genre, but this sort of flattening of naturalistic forms and creating this more graphic elements, these build-ups that create these vibrations in the work. And I'm trying to bring that same pixelization, fracturing into the landscapes that I'm creating. Again, another one of the Pacific Northwest. I grew up outside of Chicago in a suburb, a western suburb, that was very similar to many suburbs in the country. And so my idea of going into landscape was that idea of going into a forest preserve, walking into the trees, taking a bike ride, that sort of thing, looking towards the city, but in these sort of naturally protected zones within that. And I'm making paintings about this connection. This is close to 11 feet long and 9 feet tall. And the shapes, this forest that is really just kind of a graphic barrier in the back, that stuff is kind of still happening in my work today. It's a little bit different. It's not created in the same way, but these ideas of geometric fracturing, these buildings, these layerings, this almost theatrical setting of this form in front of this form in front of this form to create these kind of new things. And I'm making these drawings that at the time, again, felt sort of like these other things that I was doing to kind of reconcile this space. But this was 4 years ago what I'm making right now. So, today when I was looking over these old images, I was kind of surprised at how similar some of this work is to what I'm doing right now. Is an installation shot. I'm still making the drawings that are omitting the man-made forms with the more naturalistic stuff rendered in graphite and built up that way, this fluffiness of the Pacific Northwest. I'm still thinking about Iceland and making drawings about that, but I'm feeling the need for change. I'm feeling the need to kind of push this work forward. I'm making kind of the same work. And so I zoom in. I make the forms more monolithic. I want that void to be more abstract, more present, to create a different kind of space. Here we have the TERLINGUA store and the drawing that was made from it. And this drawing is actually in the show right now. So it kind of gives a great idea of the source imagery that is then used to create some of these drawings, the real places, cutting out and creating this space, this sort of abstraction. I'm still making paintings as a connection to this, but they're sort of running parallel. They're not overlapping. And I'm kept constraining myself to these certain ideas, like I have to make drawings that don't have the man-made and have the nature, or vice versa. And I'm just kind of a little bit getting bored in my own studio practice, and I want to kind of make something else. And these are littered everywhere on the side of the highway in Texas, and they're kind of beautiful and have that sense of humor that I'm missing. At the same time, I was asked to participate in the Alley Cat project, in which I created these wheat paste bunny bombs and pasted them all around different alleyways in Austin. And this to me was just a huge kind of refresh. It felt sort of like a big weight off my shoulders and was really similar to the work that I was making in undergrad. The work that I was making in undergrad was much more related to Nintendo systems, and this was, a long time ago at this point. Nintendo looked like this when I went to school, but much more cartoony, much more fun. This is an exploding cow with a chickmunk head, obviously. And so I want that kind of connection. I'm looking at Ed Ruscha, I'm looking at Edward Hopper, the people that were really interested to me to undergrad and still are, that eerie sense of familiarity, but also that sort of dark broodingness, the way that these super saturated colors are played against the really dark, the way that they have Leila Ali will stage and create these meticulously clean and beautiful but dark compositions. Takashi Murakami and pretty much everybody who does the Japanese super flat. These ideas we're starting to bring back into my work, and I'm doing these graphite drawings and I'm missing color. And I just, again, I'm kind of itching for that next step in my work. I'm reading some writings of Robert Ryman and his ideas and his association with white and the visceralness of paper and what is painted white versus the white of paper and what is an object and what is the wall next to this object. And I'm making my drawings and I'm like, what if I painted this space? What if this space wasn't paper, but I painted it white? In my head, I'm like, this is huge. This is gonna be amazing. And so I diligently filled in these spaces with white paint, and I stepped back and I was like, that was the lamest step that I have ever made in my work. If I'm going to paint these spaces, I should paint them. They should be full and have color. They should have that sort of same pop sensibility. Take these ideas from from popular culture, from nail polishes, whatever that might be, this sort of fun brightness. And this is the big step for me that is the clear connection to the work that we're seeing in the gallery today. So this was a huge, big moment for me. Plus, I was just having a lot more fun. I was so sick of the white page at that point. So I'm still making these more naturalistic paintings. I'm trying to find that connection between the oil paintings that I make and the gouache and graphite drawings that I make. There's this flattening out of the gouache that it doesn't matter if this is high architecture, if this is an abandoned building. When you paint these shapes in gouache, it just makes them all the same. It makes them all other. It makes them familiar, yet spaceships that are floating down and gently almost landing on this weird graphite space. I'm looking at the photography of James Welling and his modernist houses and his kind of interactions between these harsh geometric forms and these natural spaces. I love Paul Klee and his use of color, this idea that this orange-red rectangle that is so hard and fast in this grid system then floats forward but then sinks back. He made these pieces after traveling to Egypt and seeing that stacking of that environment along the Nile and kind of making this naturalistic form out of this abstraction. So they're abstracted, but then they somehow become more real. And I'm trying to bring those ideas into my work, making the buildings feel and function in that same sort of abstracted formalist space, these ideas of flipping that figure ground connection. Having this connection to the real buildings, and although they are painted, They are what's flat. They are what feels other. In reality, the drawing part of this, the graphite, is more unrealistic. It's more built up. It's more the symbols that then get layered together to kind of emulate nature without being naturalistic. I'm thinking about how houses carve and separate the sky from the earth, how to fracture that apart, how this building seems out of time. It is a building that exists, a bar in Tucson, in which the whole entire inside is a dedication to Kennedy and his presidency. But it still has that, like, is this 50 years in the past or 50 years in the future? I'm not quite sure. So these kind of connections to these buildings, having the scrim of the trees become a blockade, a visual blockade between us and the building behind it, but also letting the building behind it kind of dictate and fracture that space. The graphite is still doing so much of that heavy lifting, that dark mass that just eats up the paper, but it is competing and it's holding its own with these bright, super saturated poppy colors. This is a bank along I-35 between Waco and Dallas that I drove by many times before forcing some people to pull over to the side of the road so I could take a photograph of it. But again, that sort of sense of it being out of time, that this could spin, that this could land, and that these are other, but they're also new. So here's an installation shot of those pieces. I'm doing kind of other work here and there, still finding that itch, still needing to kind of make do things. This is one of the few images that includes people, despite me teaching lots of figure drawing classes. I rarely have people. There's often that sort of absence of people inside some of my drawings. I was talking to people earlier about the camper in the show right now and that door being open. That's one of the few times where I have a building in which the viewer has a point of entry into that space. That's kind of unusual. I usually like to create these big blocks that say, no, you can't come further, and then no again, you can't come further. This is the Golden Waffle. It's a local, slow business that's currently under transitioning to something else. It's kind of off Highway 101. So I'm always looking at the landscapes around me and what I'm seeing and where I'm living and trying to kind of incorporate that into my work. I'm feeling less and less tied to what is real, and I'm taking more liberties and abstracting these spaces and stacking these new forms. The Dorn Pyramid in San Luis Obispo. The Pleasure Seekers, Sunset Drive-In. Hopefully many of you recognize that space, although I don't know if they've ever played the Pleasure Seekers there. And creating this kind of eeriness. An architect recently told me that I make Beckett-like trees, and I took that as a really big compliment. I like that sort of dark tragicness of some of these lonely, squalid, arid buildings. This idea that this could be a house that lives in a physical space, but it also could just be a big cardboard cutout that somebody plopped inside of a landscape, and it really is that flat and that unrealistic. So I'm still kind of thinking about how we as viewers are sort of breaking apart this relationship between the man-made and the naturalistic, how it's framed, how that could then be carried through in a drawing, these weights of paper, and all of that kind of wonderful formal and ideological differences, but brings me to today and this show that's going on right now. Thanks. Does anybody have questions? Mm-hmm. In the show, yeah. Uh-huh.
What is the pink thing that was
It is anything you want it to be. Yeah. I kind of saw that as some hint of the interior. I'm interested in this sort of interior-exterior view now, and that's kind of what we're seeing in this, if I was in one of these modernist buildings that I've created and looking outward at the landscapes that I kind of draw, what would that space look like? So it's just sort of a hint of a glimmer of an interior.
Maybe take the glasses off and put them back on.
Oh, thank you. Could be. It'd be an interesting person. Yeah.
So what are the stages of your drawing process when you're basically photograph, right?
I take tens of thousands of photographs. So I have, my computer is constantly being bogged down by images, and then I'm taking new images and throwing them on hard drives. But that's really just sort of the beginning composition. From there, I start with a blank white sheet of paper, throw down the structure drawing, and build. It was really difficult when I was having those white, pristine surfaces because half of the battle was just keeping those clean. As anybody who creates drawings knows, the second you put anything down, it's there. You can't get rid of it. So that was so much of it for me. And from that there, I've kind of built, and I have less awareness of having to keep things clean because I get to paint over them now. But that's the last stage. So I build the graphite drawing first, having that shape, and then from there I sort of look at that shape and either do some sketches or in Photoshop just kind of drop and fill some colors, kind of thinking about that, and then I take the gouache and if I do it right the first time, then I can do it in a couple layers, but often I throw those colors down, they don't work, and I have to redo them.
You build the images through accretion. It's not like you see it all and it just all kind of happens. You kind of building it layer by layer as you work it.
The building process is definitely systematic, and for me, I generally have a very detailed plan of what I want a drawing to look like when I start. So I know the steps to kind of get there. It's happening less in the work now. I'm allowing for a little bit more of that play and a little bit more of happenstance to then affect a drawing, but I have a really firm, clear idea of what something's going to be. Every time I try to force it when I don't have that plan, I end up making some ugly work. Anything else? Thank you. Yeah. Yeah?
They're so fastidious, like, you know.
What?
Not so much,
I have magic. I don't sweat. My body is dry. No. It is just being very aware. I have like a ritual of cleaning the entire space before I begin a drawing, and then I draw and I start to kind of layer upon that. And every time I'm working, I'm always putting clean sheets of paper underneath my hands as I kind of continue to work and build up. And the second those start to get stuffed, then I recycle and get new pieces. And at first, it was something that I had to be very, very aware of. For better or worse now, I kind of do it without thinking. I'm a little bit, I don't know, OCD in my studio maybe, but it's just being very, very aware.
Yeah. Have you ever kind of let go of that a little bit of just that I'm going to be messy today? Like,
I'm trying to think if I've ever done that in my life. No. In my paintings, absolutely. That definitely, I think that's why I have to and like having oil paintings as well as these graphite drawings. Is in many ways they're different energies. For my graphite drawings, that's when I'm fastidious and I have a plan. I kind of build that from there. In my paintings, it is not like that. There is so much that is just you have to build it up and then go off of what you're doing and see what's happening and react to that and continue to build. And having a day where you kind of just lay things down and then coming back the next day and deciding that's awesome or that's ugly and then continuing to kind of build. So I think that they exist almost for the kind of different parts of my personality and different kinds of energies. I have definitely had incidents where I've messed up drawings and smudged things and most of the time I'm able to kind of work it back in. There have been like a few times with like pasta sauce was involved that didn't go well, but it's okay. We don't have to talk about it. I blocked it out of my mind.
You talk about graphite, but forms of graphite. Can you explain the powder and pencil shape? Is there a medium involved in fixing this so it doesn't pull around?
Kinds of graphite, all of the above, I would say. I tend to work with mechanical pencils, which is kind of a no-no because I always tell my students, no, you use different edges of the pencil and you sharpen it and you build it up through that. I do use that, but I have graphite powder, which a lot of the skies happen in graphite powder and brushes and kind of building that up and erasing that back with kneaded erasers and chamois. Then I have a series of mechanical pencils, 203s, 205s, 207s, 209s, and HB and 2B in each one. And so I kind of go back and forth through that because there's so much of that repetition of that mark and that straight edge and the building up, that uniformity of the line is important to me, and that's something that I really only can get from mechanical pencils. So I'm not really using mechanical pencils because I like them more, but just because they work the best for the marks that I want to achieve. But lots of fixing those layers and then continuing to build. I erase, I would say, more than I draw. So much of that sculpting and that shaping and all of that happens through whittling a click eraser down to the perfect point and sculpting a sky with a kneaded eraser and a chamois, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Ryan.
You kind of started to answer this question, but why graphite rather than something like charcoal that you might be kind of comfortable with the same range and expressiveness?
I choose graphite over charcoal because of the tightness, the cleanness of it. Charcoal in many of the sections, like the sky, the looser sections, would work beautifully and magically, and it would take 1/8 of the time to do it. But graphite has this ability to allow that looseness, but also to kind of tighten it down to that refinement. And in many of the, especially the forest areas and the lawn areas where it is just throwing a giant straight edge down and mark after mark after mark after mark, that I wouldn't be able to do in charcoal. So I'm picking graphite very specifically because the output, I think, can be best expressed through the material of graphite. Plus it has that lovely soft gray that works really well for me.